Hello and welcome to the Middle East Forum Speaker Webinar Series. Through the end of the year, our project directors will be joining us to give us an update on what your funds have accomplished to date and the plans for the coming year. I'm Stacey Roman and I will be moderating this discussion today. We're pleased to have Cliff Smith, Director of the Washington Project here at the Middle East Forum, join us to discuss to give us an end of year update on how the Washington Project enacts reform in Congress. Cliff will speak for 15 to 20 minutes and open it up for questions. Should you wish to ask a question, please use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to type out your question. And with that, I'll turn the discussion over to Mr. Cliff Smith.
Hey, Stacey, how are you doing? Good to meet everybody here. Anyhow, as she mentioned, I am the director of the Middle East Forum's Washington Project. And first, let me just start real simple. What is the Washington Project? The Washington Project is the Middle East Forum's liaison to decision makers and opinion leaders in Washington, D.C. What does that mean? That means I interact with people in the administration, in Congress, at different embassies around Washington, D.C. But it means more than that too. It also means working with other think tanks, working with journalists sometimes, working with other activists that are involved in our same issues to try to accomplish a similar goal. So it really is, in a sense, I suppose, Middle East Forum's ambassador to Washington, D.C. Anybody that can help us entrench Middle East Forum's ideas and desired policies and such into the minds of people that make decisions and to help them actually effectuate those decisions are something we do. And as far as that goes, it's also good to stress that we do, in fact, certainly focus on big picture issues. We talk about radical Islam, we talk about Israel, we talk about Iran, we talk about these kinds of things when they're asked of us and when the situation presents itself. However, everybody talks about those kinds of issues that is involved in these kinds of things at all. So one thing that's very important that we do is that we look for pieces of those issues, smaller pieces that are doable politically, that we can really have an impact on, and make sure those kinds of things happen, and make sure that people know about them, that they need to be done, that there is work to be done that can have a positive impact, and that is a big part of what the Washington Project does, is look for those openings and then do what they can to make it happen. Let me start with one example. Many of you have probably heard of, and are concerned about, rightfully so, of the Muslim Brotherhood or Salafis or other radicals from the Middle East. However, radical Islam is a worldwide phenomenon. Radical ideologies do not know geographic boundaries. And people at the Middle East Forum, especially in our Islamist Watch branch, have been increasingly concerned about Jamaat-e-Islami. Now, Jamaat-e-Islami is linked in many ways to the Muslim Brotherhood. The founder of Jamaat-e-Islami was quite close with a number of Muslim Brotherhood theologians and founders, and they corresponded and so on and so forth. But they're predominantly out of South Asia. However, we discovered through our research that a number of groups that are linked with Jamaat-e-Islami in the US, mainly the Islamic Circle of North America and Helping Hands for Relief and Development, their international aid arm, were pretty overtly tied and even openly associated with terrorists in the Middle East, such as Hizbul Mujahideen, such as Lashkar-e-Taiba. We worked with different members last year to get a bill introduced calling attention to these problems and the wider problem of Jamaat-e-Islami. Just slightly over a year ago, we had an event in Washington, D.C. calling attention to Jamaat-e-Islami to discuss the bill, to discuss all the problems in the US and abroad. And then almost a year ago, almost to the day, I think it was 2 or 3 days from now, we discovered something very interesting, that all of our work had getting this bill introduced and raising this to the public consciousness had blowback, but in a good way for our point of view. We found out that some of these radical Islamic groups were openly pushing back against what we were saying in Congress by providing to members of Congress a secret dossier attacking Middle East Forum's research. They had to hire a large international law firm to try to discredit letters that members of Congress had sent and things they had made in order to try to discredit the pressure they were feeling as a result of us pointing out demonstrable facts about these organizations. Now, when you actually tore apart their memorandum and their claims and their secret memos to Congress that they had been passing out, it was, to be blunt, garbage. It was dodges. It was easily disprovable half-truths at best, and sometimes outright lies. But we had a great deal of fun showing that to reporters. We had a great deal of fun writing about that and calling it out. And frankly, it showed that what we had done had drawn real blood and really spooked the radicals we were looking to call out. What's more, this resulted in a whole bunch more articles on these various topics and a lot more research into these topics. We now this year and last year have been published and reported on more in media in Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, certainly than we ever have before. It was a huge bonanza of information and a huge bonanza of coverage of the kinds of things we were doing. And it was because it was being undercovered. Nobody was really concerned about this, and it's a big issue, and it's going to be a bigger issue going forward. Another thing we were able to discover through this was that some of these radical Islamic networks that were primarily from South Asia were also very close to a number of organizations that were anti-Israel. The anti-India, pro-radical Islam in Pakistan and Bangladesh type movements are very closely aligned, openly so, with the BDS movement, with American Muslims for Palestine, other radical Muslim Brotherhood linked organizations, and other kinds of organizations that are anti-Israel. So in other words, they are working together against their common foes, India and Israel. And we are trying to point that out. And nobody had really done that before, not in any sustained way. And we are working at doing that. Just a good example of the kinds of ways that we have been effective at pointing out things that are important, part of a broader mission that then get focused on a smaller issue. Another one is Qatar, specifically Al Jazeera and Al Jazeera in the US. As you know, Qatar is a big problem across the board. Qatar is increasingly the funder of terrorism and radical organizations around the Middle East. They are viciously anti-Semitic. They have the biggest propaganda network of anybody in the Middle East. And yet there has been very little pushback from far too many people that ought to know better about this fact. Too many people are stuck in the past thinking that the Saudis or are the worst actor, which while they certainly have their problems, no longer are. Too many people, don't understand how Turkey has changed, so on and so forth. But one thing we realized we could do was that Al Jazeera in the US does not comply or has not complied until recently with laws regarding foreign agents. Foreign agents, including media under different circumstances legally, are required to register and make public certain facts about themselves and their funding. Al Jazeera had basically just openly defied the law and claimed they did not have to do this. For years, Middle East Forum has been working to call attention to this fact and to encourage disclosure for Al Jazeera and their foreign and their obvious, very clear fact that they are commanded by the Qatari regime. Nonetheless, it hadn't happened. While the law allowed for the government to require them to register, it did not. It was not required that they enforce the law. Essentially, we worked hard to try to bring attention to this to the administration. We tried in Congress to get language added to different bills that would basically tighten the grip of the administration, able to do this easier and make the enforcement clearer, even mandatory in some circumstances. For various factors, while we were successful on some of those efforts and not successful in others, but until just a few months ago, unfortunately, for a lot of complicated reasons, Al Jazeera was not required to register yet. Finally, while we were trying to get even more language added, Senator Rubio and some others that we were talking to and informing about this problem and discussing the law and the history and all these kinds of things related with them, said, well, look, why don't we just write a letter to the administration saying we think that you really need to enforce this law against Al Jazeera? And I said, that sounds great, let's do it. So I worked with Senator Rubio's office. They drafted a letter. They got 10 other members of Congress, both House and Senate, to demand that Al Jazeera register. And that drew a lot of attention. We tried to support their efforts by writing op-eds and talking on the radio and so on about this issue. And a month after that letter was sent by Senator Rubio and 10 other members of Congress, the administration formally required Al Jazeera to register as a foreign agent. And so that was a big win of something we've been working on for years. There's two lessons that I take from that. One is don't give up. We have been working on that for years, and it took us a while to get there. The second is, we were, the first focus was to try to, have stronger language in the law, which would have been great, but we already had some pretty good language. But when one thing doesn't work, find another way. And in this case, while we didn't get what we first were trying for, we got a letter that ended up accomplishing the same goal. And there's always ways to work around things like that in Washington. And that's something that we look for and continue to do every single day. Another issue that we're able to have a great deal of success on in this past year is the issue of higher education and anti-Semitism, apologetics for terrorism, other waste of taxpayer money when it comes to Middle East studies, and so on and so forth, and calling attention to this and getting at least a little bit of hard work done in the administration on this. Title VI of the Higher Education Act is what funds a lot of Middle East study centers around the US, the biggest ones. Title VI has certain requirements that these schools are supposed to abide by. They are supposed to have balance in their curriculum. They are supposed to fulfill certain language requirements, and they're supposed to be in service of US national security needs. Nonetheless, this has largely been ignored. We have been calling attention to Title VI and the problems therein for years. Finally, our efforts paid off in at least one small way. Duke UNC, a Middle East Studies consortium funded by Title VI, there was an investigation open due to some of the issues we've been raising into their practices and how they spend federal dollars. This resulted in a Department of Education investigation, which found that most of the money they received from Title VI was not spent appropriately according to the law. This was not, however, the last word on the subject. The education blob, as former Education Secretary Bill Bennett once called it, certainly it instantly started fighting back. But nonetheless, we knew that the Duke UNC instances were just the tip of the iceberg. So working with Campus Watch people, we were able to show very similar kinds of things that had raised concerns in Duke UNC took place at a number of other universities. As such, we were able to convince a number of congressmen to make public requests of the administration to start other investigations into other universities, Georgetown, University of Arizona, University of California, Berkeley, and Yale, and to point out these kinds of problems about anti-Semitism, apologetics for terrorism, basically downplaying the US national security concerns, things of that nature, and say, hey, look, you're getting money for a specific purpose. If you want to teach these things, that's your right, but not with federal dollars that are specifically for a different purpose. And we were able to publicly call these out. I am aware of investigations that were started because of this. Unfortunately, it is looking like, due to the clock, some of these investigations might not ultimately be made public. Nonetheless, again, with the lesson of continuing to try and look for other ways of doing things when one thing doesn't work perfectly, we were able to also get a request made by Senator Rubio and Senator Kramer of South Dakota to have a GAO audit of all Title VI funds, specifically looking at anti-Semitism and related issues, although not exclusively to those issues. The GAO is a congressional agency. It is not affected by any changes in the administration. Thus, is what will happen is that this audit, should everything go appropriately, will continue regardless of anything else. While we are not hoping for the moon, certainly this helps us continue to put pressure on the universities to reform, continues to call attention to these issues. And again, this is a long fight for a much bigger issue about fairness in the Middle East, about fighting against anti-Semitism, against pushing for moderation in Islam, and for not giving our approval to radical Islam, so on and so forth, in the educational system, which eventually impacts so much of our national security. Anyhow, these are just a few examples of the things we have done. There's a whole host more I could discuss. I can tell you that we have worked with congressional actors and administration officials on actions to sanction PLO officials that are involved in the infamous pay to slay programs in Israel. We have dealt with charities that are engaged in blatant anti-Semitism and involved in terrorism in the Middle East that have gotten attention in Europe and have their funds cut in Europe, but continue to be funded and continue to associate with the administration, and worked with them, to officials in the administration, to call this out, worked with people in the media to bring more attention to what is really going on here, because it's gotten ignored so much. We have worked to continue to work to roll back UNRWA's definition of a refugee, which, as you may know, is expansive and different than any other refugee in the world. And these refugees, purported Palestinian refugees, mandate a right of return, is what they demand, to all of Israel, which would destroy Israel as a Jewish state, which was, of course, the purpose for its existence. There is a report in existence, which we had a hand in creating, that tells the true number of refugees, given US law, given the UN High Commission on Refugees use a different definition, which would be only tens of thousands, not millions. It would have diminished, not increased over time. We just recently, the Congress, at least 12 members of Congress signed a letter that would call for the declassification of that report, which never should have been classified in the first place. I can tell you that some of these things have not just involved the US government. They have involved bringing these kinds of issues about, terror-connected charities, about anti-Semitism in these kinds of charities that purport to be just, innocent charities. We have talked to intelligence agencies in the US and even abroad. We've talked to some of the intelligence officials of other countries about some of our findings as a result of our work here in Washington. So in any event, that's a lot to take in, I'm sure. I hope it all made sense. This is the kind of thing that the Middle East Forum does every day in Washington, trying to bring attention to these issues, trying to get action on these issues, and trying to move the ball forward. We just try to grind it out a little bit at a time. Hope that gets at a lot of the kinds of things you're interested in, and I hope it shows you what we have accomplished in the past year and what we hope to accomplish going on in the future.
All right, thank you so much for that great rundown of all the amazing work that the Washington Project has been doing in the past year. The first question we have is it a concern or problem that MSNBC has hired a new commentator from Al Jazeera?
Yeah, I'm aware of that, and it certainly is a concern. And I think it's, I believe one of our people has written an article about it. I mean, it is, difficult for policymakers to affect, what different media organizations hire people. I mean, it's not like, the First Amendment applies to, certainly US citizens and others too. So it's not like we can hire them. What we can do is call it out. And so when we can have people write about it. And moreover, something I try to do whenever I meet with anybody is, if they come to me and say, oh, here's this thing I heard about the Middle East or radical Islam or Israel or anything else, I can say, well, that isn't really true. The thing that this guy said on MSNBC, that isn't true. And by the way, here's some research showing it. Here's our perspective on things. That's the kind of thing that I think is more important. It's not that, while it's a concern, what we can really do is tell the truth. And when we hear people by untruth, we can respond with truth.
Thank you. Do any other countries other than Israel and the US see Qatar as guilty of actions and support that are threatening the civilized world?
Certainly. Actually, the the funny truth of the matter is the countries that dislike Qatar even more than Israel are a lot of the other Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia, UAE, um, Bahrain, Egypt. A whole bunch of these countries are far more concerned about Qatar even than Israel is. It threatens them much more directly. Al Jazeera and its propaganda threatens them much more directly. Matter of fact, I mean, I have personally spoken, I shouldn't give too many details, but I can say I have personally spoken to embassy officials at some of these different embassies about this issue. I can certainly tell you they are concerned, in some case are far more concerned than Israel is about it, which is not to say that Israel isn't concerned. I can just say that it is a pressing issue, and that we work with people like that from countries like that to try to effectuate change whenever we can.
Wonderful, thank you. And what are the chances for a successful outcome to the reintroduction of Ted Cruz's bill to get the Muslim Brotherhood declared a terrorist organization?
I believe in telling you hard truths rather than comforting untruths. There is, even in the first 2 years of the Trump administration, with in a new administration with large majorities in both, or at least some majorities in both houses of Congress. That's not a large majority in the Senate. That bill, which we supported and which I lobbied in favor of, which I took some of our fellows to testify in favor of, was not able to pass. And I do not expect that will change when circumstances are less favorable. That said, this is an issue that keeps getting raised, and it has real world impact. People know about this more because of it, and it's something that is the focus of people's thinking. And sometimes, you can't get, the whole enchilada, but you can get pieces of it. For example, a few years ago, when this bill was kicking around, then Congressman DeSantis, now Governor DeSantis, had a hearing in his subcommittee in the Oversight and Government Reform Committee focused on the Muslim Brotherhood with the idea that they ought to be designated as a terrorist entity. Now, at this point, I think most people knew that probably wasn't going to happen, but the idea was to bring more facts about the Muslim Brotherhood and its many tentacles to the light. The Middle East Forum had just recently had a very large report on Islamic Relief published. Islamic Relief is, I would argue, the most important branch of the Muslim Brotherhood in the West. We showed how they had nonstop, high-level affiliations with the Muslim Brotherhood, including their founders, who were actual members of the Shura Council. We showed how they are connected with terrorists in Gaza. We showed their virtual nonstop anti-Semitism, so on and so forth. And we were able to bring that to members of the committee, the Oversight and Government Reform Committee, and we got that entered into the record. We had witnesses talk about it. We had congressmen talk about it. So, so the point is that things like Ted Cruz's bill, which I assume will be introduced in the next Congress as well, even if it doesn't pass, it's not totally futile. It affects the debate. It calls things into the limelight. And as a Supreme Court justice famously once said, sunlight is the best disinfectant. And a good chunk of what we do is to try to do sunlight. We can only do so much. I'm not a member of Congress. I'm not a senator. I'm not a part of the State Department or Homeland Security. What I can do is continually shine sunlight in a hope that these people do the right thing. And over time, things do move in our direction, I believe.
Thank you so much. Do you think that the role of radical Islamist group will increase or decrease after the peace agreements are signed by the Arabs and Israel?
That's a very interesting question. An honest answer would be I don't know. I think it's very interesting that here's something interesting, and this kind of goes back to some of the things I've already talked about. A number of the radical Islamist groups that we deal with, you may have heard that, are domestic, that have their roots in the Middle East, but are domestic. CARE, ISNA, some of these other organizations. They are now facing problems in their own backyard. The Gulf no longer likes them. Saudi does not like them. UAE does not like them. Bahrain does not like them. Egypt hates them, so on and so forth. And what's more, the Palestinian cause is no longer seen in the same light as it once was in the Arab world. And so things are changing. The rest of the Arab world is getting friendlier with Israel. It's interesting to watch because, and this is what goes back to something I mentioned about like BDS and American Muslims for Palestine, all of a sudden focused working with South Asian groups. These sort of Islamists are now sort of being exposed as being a minority among their own people, which we have said for decades. But now that they are losing their own people in their own backyard, they're moving on to other causes. They're now focusing on Kashmir, things that are going on in South Asia, and they're partnering with radicals from there because they need new rallying cries. They need new friends, they need new allies because they're losing other ones. What I can say is, regardless of how much pressure they face now, even from their own people, from diaspora in Europe and the US, from the governments back home, so on and so forth, they will try to find new ways to be influential and new causes to rally around, because ultimately they're not about freedom for or opportunity for Arabs or Muslims in the Middle East. They are for Islamic supremacy, and that is a minority even among their own people. They'll go find new causes. We will expose that, and we will work to break that up. That's a lot of what the work we've done in the last year or so has been.
Thank you so much. And along the lines of the Palestinian refugees, we have a question in. I have a strong interest in the refugee definition issue and would like to know which congressmen have signed the request for declassification, if that is.
I was working with several members of Congress that were interested in this issue, and it was Friday that they told me they were just rounding up signatures and sending it. They have not actually sent me the final copy of what they sent to the State Department, so I cannot tell you. I can say it involves a number of people that we have worked with before on this issue, that we are very close with, like Congressman Lamborn, who I did a webinar with a little while ago, Congressman Stewart of Utah, which has been very supportive on this issue for a number of years, and at least, I think, 10 others. I don't know if they got a few more at the last second, and I don't have a list of names right in front of me. What I can say is that we have been working on this issue for quite some time, and we're really hoping that that report will be made public, and we will keep on doing whatever we can to call attention to this issue.
All right, thank you so much. And we haven't talked about the Title VI funds yet. So have any Title VI funds been withdrawn because of the criticisms of the Middle East studies criteria?
No, unfortunately, no. I wish that were not the case, but no, they have not yet. I think perhaps, though, if you really want to see how effective it was, though, look at the reaction from the universities. After some of these investigations were open and some of this was made public, there was a huge amount of media pushback at a very high level from all kinds of different universities. Bluntly, if this was a joke that they could laugh off, they wouldn't have bothered. It shows they are scared of it. They realize the problem, and I'm not saying it's going to change their behavior overnight, but if we are getting them to think twice before they, as the case was with Duke UNC, have a Palestinian rapper that's openly going to say, I hate Jews and so should you, which was the gist of what he's saying on stage, they're going to think twice about that. Again, sometimes you have to look for the small victories, take half a loaf and keep grinding out more.
Great. And one last question on that. Have we used the threat of lawsuits to ensure that the Title VI provisions are enforced and complied with at various U.S. universities? Is that an option?
That's not the kind of thing we don't get directly involved in. I can say that, and frankly, it would be difficult to find a client that would have standing that would really be able to appropriately enforce that. I don't know if that would be possible. It might be. It would be difficult. What I can tell you is we have worked with a whole slew of partner organizations on this topic. And we continue to communicate with a number of other organizations that are very concerned about this topic, some of which take various different approaches to work on this specific issue. And I do think that should there be efforts, either administratively or even legal challenges of different sorts that could potentially exist, the work we have done make that kind of thing a lot easier. It calls facts into the light. It shows concern on policymakers and administrations, and that will make those kinds of efforts much more palatable over time.
Thank you so much. And should our viewers wish to support the Washington projects, how can they do that?
We'd really appreciate that, especially it's coming in the end of our fiscal year. You can just go to our contribution form, meforum.org/participation, and you can donate online. It also gives you a number of other ways you can donate. It'd be great if you could just note that it's for the Washington Project too. We do a lot of good work here. It's a lot of hard work, but we have continued to grind out wins, and I would say have an impact far above our size, and we would like to continue to do so, and we could really use your help.
All right, well, thank you so much. We've come to the close of our webinar. Thank you again, Cliff, for taking time to speak with us today.
Thank you, Stacey.
Of course. For our viewers, as you finish up or start your holiday shopping this year, we would like to remind you that we are a part of the Amazon Smile charity program. You can select the Middle East Forum as your charity, and Amazon will donate 0.5% of the price of the eligible purchases to the charity of your choice. So far this year, we have received over $1,000 through this program alone. Also, please join us Wednesday at 3 p.m. Eastern for our weekly update with Ashley Perry. And thank you all for joining us. I hope you have a wonderful day.